Hello, this is Soc 243A Criminology. I'm Professor Moran, and this lecture is entitled Moffat's Adolescence Limited and Life Course Persistent Offenders, Part 3. In the second part of this lecture set, we examined the first of Moffat's groups, Life Course Persistent Offenders. Very briefly, we noted that life course persistent offenders exhibit antisocial behavior of various types at each stage of their life course from early childhood onward. We also noted that, although statistically a small minority, life course persistent offenders are disproportionately involved in documented offenses. We traced the development of life course persistent offenders, or the emergence of this behavior, from the fetus to roughly adulthood, although we did not define a specific endpoint of this process. Now let's take a look at the second and final group Moffat describes in our article, Adolescence Limited Offenders. There are two things we need to note about adolescence limited offenders. Number one, they have no notable history of antisocial behavior in childhood and exhibit little antisocial or criminal behavior in adulthood. Number two, they constitute the majority of offenders found in the age crime curve. Indeed, the large spike in criminality during the teenage years is due to this population and their offending. Across age, the change in delinquent behavior for adolescence limited offenders is abrupt, increasing rapidly in adolescence and decreasing with equal rapidity in early adulthood. It makes sense, therefore, to look at the teenage years for the sources or causes of this significant increase, but then significant decrease in antisocial behavior amongst life course or adolescence limited offenders. Simple question. Why do they, adolescence limited offenders, become delinquent all of a sudden during adolescence? As a general point, Moffat notes the following. Adolescence-limited delinquents are likely to engage in antisocial behavior in situations where such responses seem profitable to them, but they are also able to abandon antisocial behavior when pro-social styles are more rewarding. So at this point, the question or point might be, well, what is it about antisocial behavior that makes it seem profitable for many adolescents during their teenage years? Moffat argues that adolescence-limited delinquency is a social mimicry that is imitation of the antisocial style of life course persistent youths. In animal behavior, the mimic species adopts the social behavior of the more successful species to obtain access to a valuable resource. If this is the case with adolescent limited offenders, then logically delinquent behavior must be one which allows them access to some desirable resource. But what is that resource? The answer to this question, according to Moffat, necessitates an understanding of the nature of the modern industrial period, which is said to have begun roughly in the 1750s and occurs or continues until the present day. In the pre-industrial period, that is, from before 1750, the vast majority of people were farmers, and the majority of people did exactly what their parents did when they reached their adult role. Reaching your adult role in the pre-industrial age is relatively simple. The maturation from your child role to your adult role more or less coincided with your biological maturation, and there wasn't much of an in-between period between the two roles, that of the child and the adult. Once biological maturity occurred, it was assumed that the child then become an adult, or at least some version of an adult. However, in modern industrial societies, the entrance into the adult role has become postponed. In the pre-industrial age, there tended to be a quick transition between the child status and the adult status, which generally coincided with biological maturation. In the modern industrial period, things are very different, however. Adulthood or entering into adult roles is significantly delayed. Typically, one leaves childhood at the age of 12, but does not gain a full adult status until the ages of 22. Thus, characteristic of the modern experience is a period or in-between period between childhood and adulthood that we have called adolescence. As Moffat notes, changes in health and work have lengthened the duration of adolescence. The ensuing gap leaves modern teenagers in a 5 to 10 year role vacuum. They are biologically capable and compelled to be sexual beings, yet they are asked to delay most of the positive aspects of adult life. So, modern teenagers are caught in a maturity gap between biological age. Sexual and physical maturation generally occurs around 14, and social age, that is adult independence and autonomy, which does not occur until ages 22 or 24. In the pre-industrial era, biological maturation and social maturation occurred more or less at the same time. This maturity gap between biological maturation and then social maturation is experienced, according to Moffat, by many teenagers as a problem. What's the solution? Social mimicry. But social mimicry of whom? What Moffat suggests is that adolescent limited offenders socially mimic the personal style and behavior of life course persistent offenders that they encounter in their lives, many of whom will be in their interactions at school. What may be noticed is that life course persistent offenders do not seem to suffer much from the maturity gap. The question here posed is why? Moffat notes that this may be due to several reasons. Life course persistent offenders may, one, have an independent income, which affords them possessions otherwise inaccessible to other teenagers. Cars, clothes, drugs, entering into adult-only settings, bars and clubs, and so on. Number two, appear freer from their family of origin. They go their own way and according to their own rules. This includes, in many instances, with teachers. Number three, have more sexual experience. And number four, have adult problems, an arrest record, a probation officer, an attorney, maybe a small business that is selling drugs, and possibly a child. In short, the life course persistent style, including behaving delinquently, appears attractive to the Adolescence Limited group because this behavior seems to resemble adulthood more than it resembles childhood. Thus is a solution to the maturity gap experienced by the Adolescence Limited group. Thus, for teens who become Adolescence Limited delinquents, antisocial behavior and the antisocial style of the life course persistent offenders is seen as an effective way of distancing themselves from childhood and proving that they can act independently, that is, in an adult-like fashion, albeit in terms of delinquency. Thus, for adolescent limited offenders in the adolescent or teenage years, every cigarette smoked, every curfew violated, every drug taken is conceived as a statement of personal independence and thus a reinforcer for delinquency. Moffat notes that even the negative consequences of delinquent behaviors can convey a certain status to the adolescent limited delinquent. Reasonable question then. So why does the Adolescence Limited group more or less cease antisocial and delinquent behavior as they age into their 20s? This is because as Adolescence Limited offenders age, number one, more legitimate and tangible adult roles become available to them, as in, may have an improved income, more freedom, more choices, etc. Number 2, the meaning of illegal behavior shifts from rewarding, that is a source of status and affiliation with adulthood, to punishing, that is the delinquent behavior may risk employment, completing college, annoy a partner, and so on. As antisocial or delinquent behavior shifts from meaning to status enhancing to punishing or risky, adolescent limited offenders begin their abrupt cessation or desistance from crime. Part of the reason why this is possible is because without a lifelong history of antisocial behavior, the forces of or the consequences of antisocial behavior have not had the same amount of time for adolescent limited offenders to build up and to gather momentum in a way that shapes their lives without their choice. Thus, without a serious criminal record, a drug or alcohol addiction, and let's say an unwanted child, adolescent limited offenders are much more capable of turning their lives around once they enter into their early 20s, and that is their adult role. Thus, most adolescent limited offenders become regular conforming citizens, given that they have greater opportunity at the end of their adolescence to take up a conventional lifestyle. Once the rewards of a conventional lifestyle become available to them, the delinquency recedes into the past. End of Soc 243A Criminology. Moffat's Adolescence Limited and Life Course Persistent Offenders, Part 3.